For most of us, weeding is the worst job in the garden. Hours on your hands and knees pulling one stubborn weed at a time, and 2 weeks later, they're all back. It feels like a battle you can't win. It isn't. You're just doing it at the wrong time, with the wrong tool. Stacey Murphy has a weeding strategy that turns hours of pulling into minutes of skimming, standing up. And it comes with a bonus most gardeners never realize. This Q&A was recorded at a past Grow Your Own Vegetables event, where Stacey Murphy shares the weeding strategy that takes minutes instead of hours. Before we get into it, if you'd like to grow alongside thousands of other gardeners, join our free community at GYOV.org. Now, let's dig in.
All right, so let's get started. And the first question tonight is from Melissa. And her question, I love your question, Melissa. She says, do you really completely ignore weeds? That's her whole question. So I guess my answer is that I don't completely ignore weeds. So probably what you're talking about, Melissa, is that, you know, when I talked about what to focus on when you're out working in your growing space, we talked about focusing on the things that improve yield: seeding, transplanting, harvesting, soil fertility, record keeping, pruning, and trellising. And so weeding is not on that list. And so I do somewhat ignore weeds, but I also have a weed management strategy, and I really encourage you to have one. I talked a little bit about it on in the lesson, but I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So the first thing that I encourage you to do is to really train your brain to start seeing the big things first. And oftentimes the big things are what we're avoiding. It's the things that we know are going to make a huge impact in our lives, in our growing spaces, and we avoid them because either they seem too big, we don't know how to do them. Those are usually the two things. There's sometimes a fear around not doing it correctly, and so we want to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, which then just magnifies it even more and makes the task seem even bigger than it is. So I encourage you to train your brain to see those big things first that are going to make a really big impact and focus on those first. And so those are generally not weeding. And also our tendency is to do the easy things first. It's like, I know how to do these things. I've done them before. And so I'm just going to knock them off my, quote, to-do list. And then oftentimes that leaves the big things behind, or it leaves them to the end. And so what that does is typically, because our tendency is to do the easy things first, is we think, oh, there's a whole bunch of weeds. I'll just pull those out because, it's the easiest thing for me to think about right now. And it's sort of meditative, right? And I get that. I actually enjoy weeding on a meditative plane in a lot of ways. It's a very satisfying task by itself. And so sometimes we'll focus there, and then we'll leave the big thing behind because we just don't really know how to do that, like trellising our tomatoes, or something kind of big that's going to affect our yield in the long run. And so then what happens is then you don't leave yourself enough time to do the really big things, and then the big things swell, and then they take longer than you think, and then you feel like you spent so much time, and you feel like you were wasting time. And so that's the sense that I have around people who waste their time in sort of a gardening mindset, which is, doing those little easy things and beautifying and prettifying the space, which has its place. And if you want to do that, then know that you're doing it. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say about, do I really completely ignore weeds? Not totally. I'm basically focusing on these other things that are much more important. Now, if my weeds, on the other hand, were growing, immensely, and they were taking over the site, and therefore they were taking over the space, and they were building up a weed seed bank. They're growing really big, and they're dropping lots of weed seeds. Now, that's another thing.
This is the whole thing. The effort of weeding isn't really about the weeds. It's about how big you let them get. Catch them tiny, and the job almost disappears.
Another thing, you actually have to address that, right? So what I'm doing is, before those weeds are getting out of control, I'm attacking them at a strategic planning level, on an everyday level. So what I tend to do is about 10 minutes each week, and I talked a little bit about this in the weekly lesson. I'll take some sort of cultivator, like a hoe, and I'll wander around my site, and I'll basically loosen the soil around all my plants. And so that's doing a couple different things. It is essentially scuffling the earth and that top quarter to half-inch layer of soil, and being careful not to go any deeper because you don't want to hit any of the root systems of your precious vegetable crops. And so what that's doing is it's breaking up the life cycle of those weed seeds. So if you're using, in the video I showed a collinear hoe, which basically cuts the top of the plant from the root system, and both halves of the plant die, essentially, in place. If you're using something like that, then typically you want those weeds to be just barely tall enough for that to happen. So if those weeds are a quarter inch to a half an inch tall, that collinear hoe will be the perfect tool. If those weeds are any taller, though, that collinear hoe is going to have a hard time cutting through the stem, because the stem is going to be a little bit too hard. And so in that case, sometimes what I like to do is, if the weeds are a little bit bigger, if I missed a week, let's say I was on vacation, then I might use a little tiny mini hand fork. You know, it's like the partner to the trowel is that little fan tool that has the claw on the end. And what I'll do is, if the plants are a little bit bigger than the hoe can handle, is I'll take that and I'll scrape it back and forth along the soil, and basically that will dig up the top quarter-inch to half-an-inch layer of soil, and any of those bigger weeds will basically get pulled out. And in this case, it doesn't really break the stem of the weed, and so generally it pulls the weed completely out of the soil. And
this is the technique. Not bending, not pulling, skimming, standing up with a hoe held almost flat. A whole bed of seedling weeds gone in a single pass. Do it once a week and you'll never face an overgrown bed again.
And in that case, you want to actually pick your hand up. Basically what you'll find over time is that you'll scuffle the earth with this thing, and all the weeds will kind of come out together, and the claw will kind of capture them as you bring them towards you. And at that point, you can grab that mass of weeds and set it aside. And the reason you want to do that is, if you were to just scuffle it up and leave it there, it's different than the collinear hoe, which is actually cutting that weed stem in half. What it's doing is it's pulling the whole plant out by the root. And if you were to leave it, it might re-root itself, and then you'd have to pull it up again. So when you are working with the little claw and you're dragging it around and you see the plant still connected to the root system, you want to just kind of drag that towards you, claw that, kind of rake it towards you, and pull the roots out, throw them in the compost bin if they don't already have seeds on them, because that way you won't get any seeds in your compost bin if they don't have seeds on them. And so I do that sometimes. And so what I do in this weed strategy, if you think about it, if I'm doing 10 minutes each week for about 20 weeks, the season is much longer than that. The season here is really from April 15th until November 15th, which I think is about 6 months long. And so 20 weeks is not 6 months. So I'm not doing it every week. Oftentimes, I'm at the end of the season, I don't have to worry about this quite as much, because the peak season has gone down and the growth has gone away. So usually about the first 20 weeks of the season is my time that I really focus on this. And if I'm doing it 10 minutes each week, that's about 200 minutes, which is a total of about 3.3 hours. It's like 3 hours and 20 minutes over the course of the season. Now, if you think about it, that's not a whole lot of time. How many times have you spent 3 hours in your growing space and not even noticed that it's been 3 hours? So that's really fast. So I'm moving. I'm not dilly-dallying. I'm really in there, and I'm using the hoe really quickly and getting around all the plants quickly. And again, this is the 80-20 rule, is that when I'm moving this fast, I might not get every single little weed. I might get 90% of them, and that's just fine. The last 10%, they might get a little bit taller, and they'll be there in the future, and I'll knock them down another time. So the bigger they get, the easier they are to knock down. So So that's generally my weed strategy, which is essentially why I don't mulch, and we've talked about mulching a little bit as well, is that I like to do this strategy. And the other benefit of this is that this 3 hours of soil cultivation is also breaking up life cycles of pests in the soil. So
this is why some gardens seem to weed themselves into more weeds. Every deep dig wakes up the next generation. Skim shallow, leave the deeper soil undisturbed, and you starve the weed seed bank instead of feeding it.
So I really, this is one of the best bits of advice that I ever got from a farmer. It was my first growing season. I knew how to garden, but I didn't know how to grow food for a CSA. I didn't know how to be a farmer. And a farmer said to me, if you do this one thing, it will change your life. And it totally changed my life. I encourage you to try it out. So that's my weed strategy. It's been very effective. And so what I encourage you to do, Melissa, is just like I'm talking about this weed strategy in terms of, okay, how much time does it take me each week? And really just do that amount and no more. And that's a really effective strategy. I know that it's going to get most of my weeds. So train your brain to see value and effectiveness. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, if I were to just let the whole site go and not weed anything at all, at some point I would have to go through and probably pull some stuff out. And I would probably spend about 3 hours, and it might not be that big, that useful amount of time, because I might end up with more weed seeds in my bed. But here I am interrupting that cycle and really heading it off for the long run. So
this is the bonus almost nobody knows. That same weekly skim disrupts pests and diseases overwintering or pupating in the top inch of soil. One habit, 2 problems solved.
Long run. So this is a long-term strategy. It's an investment in a weed-free soil. All right. So I hope that helps. I'm not avoiding it. I'm not really ignoring my weeds. I know it sounds like I am, but I'm really not. It's a part of the strategy. Let's see. I do have one cautionary tale, however, around weeds, and that is that this year I made a horrible mistake of time, and basically I was not doing any weeding at all. I was doing a little bit of cultivation around some of the crops where they were dense food planted or where they were direct seeded, where they were babies, and I needed to make sure that those baby crops had a head start on the weeds, because the one time when weeds can be a problem is that if you have tiny weeds and they are near very tiny plants, especially root crops, they can outgrow those crops, and then basically at that point you have a growth cycle where the vegetative state of the weed cycle is ahead of the crop. Now that's a no-no, because the crop you want ahead of the weed so that it blocks out sun and the photosynthesis to that weed. So this year, I was doing some of that weeding, but what I forgot to do was that I forgot to get burlap sacks, which I usually get to my pathway, because I have exposed soil in my pathway. And I know that weeds grow pretty quickly in those pathways if I don't put something down. And so I kept putting it off. I kept saying, it'll take me an hour and a half to go do this because I got to go to the coffee place and then I got to bike it across town. And so I knew that it was going to take me an hour and a half to do it. And I just kept putting it off and saying, I don't have time this week. I don't have time this week. It's not that big of a deal. This is something that's not the essential. It's not seeding. It's not transplanting. It's not harvesting. It's not soil fertility. It's not record keeping. It's not breeding and trellising. Therefore, it's not so important. And because it was spring, everything else was very important. So I didn't do it. And then what happened is that my pathways, the grass weeds were so tall that I was starting to get a lot of mosquitoes, and also they were starting to seed. And also grass weeds have a pretty tenacious root system, and they're perennial. So if you don't get ahead of them, then oftentimes they spread. So one day I went to town and I said, okay, I'm just going to attack these as fast as I can and see how fast I can pull all of this out. And I managed to, and what I did, and this is what I would recommend for everybody who's measuring their time, is I did a little section. I said, okay, how fast can I do this section? And then I'm going to assess how long it's taking me, and I'm going to multiply it by the rest of the site to decide if this is the best strategy or not. Because another strategy would be to cover it with something and to basically smother it. And I was like, do I need to smother it, or do I need to rip it out and then put down my burlap and smother the future weeds? So I had to make this calculation. So I did a little stretch, and I said, okay, it took me 10 minutes to do this far. It's going to take me about an hour to do the whole site. And I was very excited about that because it looked like it was going to be much worse. And so I basically went to town, and in that hour I ripped everything out. And then I started doing the time investment value proposition here. And I said, okay, I just invested an hour in pulling out weeds. It would have taken me an hour and a half to go get burlap fast. And so far I've saved time because...
Think about where you started. On your knees, pulling one stubborn weed at a time, losing your weekend to it. Now you have a strategy. It was never about effort. It was about timing. Catch weeds while they're tiny, skim them off at the surface with a hoe while standing up, and disturb the soil as little as you can so you don't wake the next batch of seeds. A whole bed in minutes, once a week. And that same pass breaks the life cycles of your pests and diseases. Weeding stops being a battle. It becomes a 2-minute habit. You're not the gardener losing weekends on your knees anymore. You skim, you stand, you're done in minutes. If you want to keep learning from Stacey Murphy, join our free community of growers at GYOV.org. This Q&A was recorded at a past Grow Your Own Vegetables event, and what Stacey just shared took years of growing to learn. Now imagine sitting down with 15 experts exactly like her. 15 of the most respected gardeners, herbalists, and soil scientists on the planet, each sharing the single most powerful lesson they know. All of it waiting for you right now, completely free, at the Superfood Garden Summit. Go to growyourownvegetables.org/summit, register in 30 seconds, and start watching immediately.